So we can get started. So 2 weeks ago, we went through HTML for the content and the structure of our site. Last week, we did the beginning stuff of CSS to add some fonts and colors and some layout stuff to our site. And we did some intermediate stuff with the Flexbox when we did that navigation menu, where one part was on the left and all those buttons were on the right. Today, we are going to do some more intermediate stuff and then some intro to JavaScript. With JavaScript, you could spend hours and hours learning different things. It's a little bit more complicated than HTML and CSS. We are going to do a little bit of a jump into some more advanced JavaScript stuff, just because I want to show how you can use it to change stuff on your website. And that is usually if you're going to take like a web development course, they like go through the fundamentals of JavaScript for a while before you get to find out how do you connect it to a site. But I actually want us to play around and see something cool. So let's go all the way to the stuff for today. So we are going to focus primarily on this concept for CSS called responsive web design. And this is when you are designing your website so that it looks good on all different screen sizes. So it is expected with a lot of modern websites that it looks good on a desktop, it looks good on a tablet and on mobile. And you have to put a little bit of work into making sure that it does that when you're coding. A lot of the website builders like WordPress or Wix or Squarespace and stuff might do it by default automatically for you, which is really nice. But when you're coding it, you generally do have to do it on your own. And there's three main ways to do it. One we already explored last week, which is Flexbox, which is good for making those 1D layouts. So if you want things to be aligned horizontally, like we did with our navigation menu, you use Flexbox. If you want it to be in one single line up and down, you can also use Flexbox. The one that we're going to explore today, or we're going to explore two today, but one that we will is called Grid. And this one is similar to Flexbox, but it's a bit better at the two-dimensional layouts. So you're adding rows and you're adding columns and you're saying how many rows and columns each piece of content should span. And then the last one is a concept called media queries. And this essentially tells your browser when a person is accessing your site to look at some sort of property related to that device. Mostly when we talk about responsive web design, we're looking at the width of the screen. So a laptop or a desktop is going to have a longer width than a phone will. And so we can set media queries to say, look at the screen's width. And if it is between these numbers, or if it's higher than this, apply this specific CSS code. Or if it's in this other range, apply a different form of CSS code. We're also going to go through some JavaScript stuff. The main differences between HTML and CSS and JavaScript is that HTML and CSS are more commonly called scripting languages or coding languages. They have pretty defined rules. So like in CSS, when we're wanting to change the font family, it's the font family property to something. Or with HTML, if we want to add a link to something, we're using that A tag with an href to something. With JavaScript, it's a fully fledged programming language, meaning that you can kind of do whatever in it. JavaScript powers about 98% of the web. So there's a couple other languages that are used, but a lot of them, when they're doing web stuff, actually compile into JavaScript code because browsers do like JavaScript code. And so things are going to be a little bit more open-ended. They'll get a little complex, but we will try to introduce these concepts right now and then move into later on to actually playing around with it and seeing it in action. So what is JavaScript? The core programming language that powers the web. As I said, it's about 98% of the web runs on JavaScript, and it allows for adding functionality to your website. The one that we are going to code today is a toggle button that goes between a light theme and a dark theme for your website. So you click on it, and if it's a light theme, it changes to dark. And if it's dark and you click on it, it changes to light. And then you can also base it off of user events like we're about to do with the clicking. So this can be if a user hovers over something, some sort of behavior happens. If they click on something, some sort of behavior happens. You can all do that in JavaScript. So the first concept that I want to show in JavaScript is that there's numerous different types of data. And the main three are numbers, strings, and Booleans. So numbers are your typical like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1.5, 2.5, etc. You can do math or multiplication and stuff like that in JavaScript. Strings are just basically a bunch of characters placed back to back. Mostly you're going to use it for text. And then Booleans are something that evaluates to true or false. And I will show you that when we start coding some stuff as well. The next thing is this thing of variables. And we'll actually play around with variables in CSS today as well, where a variable is some sort of code that you create that contains a value. And so it's some sort of container, you're putting values in it so that you can reuse those values later on. So to declare it in JavaScript, you put the var keyword, so var, and then you name it. Similar to HTML and CSS, there's some best practices for how to name stuff. It's a little bit different where with variables and like anything that you're naming, it's camel casing, which means that the first word has the first letter undercase or this lowercase, and then every first letter of the next words are capitalized. And you also can't start a variable with a number, by the way, like for the name. And then the equal sign just sets it equal to some sort of a value. So in this case, I created this variable called my variable, and I assigned it a value of hello, exclamation point. And similar to CSS, we end our JavaScript with our semicolon. Now, later on, when you want to use that value of hello, you just have to type in the name of this variable and then with the semicolon. And we'll play around with variables later too. The next thing is somewhat similar, but slightly different, and that's functions. You also do have to declare one and call it. It's very similar, but instead of the var keyword, we use the function keyword, and then we add these parentheses right here, right after the name. And then we have our squiggly brackets like we've been using in our CSS. And what functions do is they allow you to use some sort of code that you put within the function. And then every time you call the function later on, it runs that code. So in our case, we're going to use a function that says, look at the theme of the user and then switch it every time they click the button. And to call it, you just put the name, the parentheses, and then this semicolon. All right, this looks a lot right here, but you can also do these things called conditional statements that essentially you're saying if this thing is true or if this thing equals this thing, do this sort of thing. But if it equals something else, do this other thing. So in our case, it's going to be something of if the current theme is light, change it to dark. Otherwise, if its current theme is dark, change it to light. You may notice that these equal signs look kind of funny because there's three. In JavaScript, if there's only one equal sign, it's assigning it a value. So we can't do if property equals value with one equals because it would reassign that property's value. So to check to see if it is equal to something, you have to use three equal signs. All right. And then this is the advanced JavaScript concept that we will go through. I will make it as easy as possible. And it's this option, or it's this concept called the DOM, or the Document Object Model. So in JavaScript, every HTML page is represented in this tree structure. And at the very top, we have this thing called document. And then right underneath that, we have our HTML tag. And then all of our content listed in here. And so we have our head tag, which again is that metadata section, our body tag, which is our main content. And then we have the title, and then we set it equal to this. And so all of our HTML in JavaScript is in this tree structure. And to change, let's say, our H1 or our page title from a heading to something else using JavaScript, you have to access the text here. using some code to get there. And I'll show you how we can do this to access that button to say, hey, with that button, when a user clicks it, do this thing. Okay, so that's later on. Let's go and open our VS Code. And so if you have downloaded the zip file that I sent out, you can go and do File, Open Folder, and then find the extracted folder from the zip one, and then click Open, and then you'll have it all over here. So I went through and with the HTML and the CSS, I added a ton of comments that explains what's happening. So if you want to just go through and say like, hey, why, you should be able to see that through these comments. If I click this go live, because we started that live server so we can see stuff, I can see how it looks right now. Main things I've changed from before is I've added some additional projects because we're going to make a 2D grid. And then I also added this button right up here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to our styles.css and we're going to start off with this intermediate CSS concept. So let's go to the way top and let's add some new lines that we can work out with. And let's go and add a comment and call it variable color styles. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to use that concept of variables to apply it with our CSS so that we can have one set of color codes that are for our light theme, and then one set of color codes that are for our dark theme. So how we are going to do this is we actually want to start off, if we go back to our HTML and go to our HTML element tag, which should be near the top, and we're going to add an attribute here. And this is going to be data-theme. So what this attribute does is it's actually just this data hyphen, and then this theme is the thing that I'm naming it. So in HTML, if you want to save some sort of data to an attribute, you can do data hyphen and then name it something. And we're going to set it equal to light. So essentially what we're doing here is we're going to say, hey, we are saving that our theme, this data about this HTML page is equal to light. And let's save that. So now back in our CSS, we want to create a sort of grouping of different colors that is related to our light theme. Now before, we would go to each element's property, like background color or this color down here, and we would just write out this color code. But CSS allows for something that's really cool. So first we need to create the container that says, if the data theme is light, use these colors. So how do you do that to access this attribute of data theme equals light is you do a square opening bracket. So similar, it should be usually the same key as that squiggly one that we've been using for CSS, but this one's square. And we can type it of data hyphen theme equals, and then in quotes, we have light. So this is that selector that is saying, hey, if an element has an attribute equal to light, and if we hover over it, we can actually see that VS Code is telling us that element data theme equals light. So we know that any element that has data theme equals light is going to have these styles. So then let's open our squiggly brackets, our curly ones right after. And now if we want to just define a color code once and not have to go over and like apply it to every different one of these selectors, because this background color is probably used a couple of times, and so on and so forth, we can assign it a name. And so to create that variable name in CSS, you would do 2 hyphens and then name it something. So in this case, I can do text, and then let's set it equal to 120 B09. And so this is creating this variable called text, and then we've set it equal to this color code. So let's go create 3 more. And so let's add one called background, and we're going to set this to FD, FB, FA. And so now I'm seeing with these little color pickers that for my light, I have this darker text and this lighter background. And then let's create one called green, and we're going to set it to A7D 1B7. And so that's kind of that seafoamy green color that we've been using. And then one last one of our blue color. And this is going to be set to 85B, 8BF. So now what we want to do is if we go down here to this background color, where it has this code, let's delete that. And now we want to reference this background color that we've defined up here. So how you do that, it's super simple. You just got to do var for variable. And then in the parentheses, you write the name. So we would do the 2 hyphens, and then you can see that all of the ones that I've defined up here show. So in this case, we want to do background. And then remember to add the semicolon at the end. So now what this is doing is saying, hey, for this body, for the background color, look at what value is saved in our variable of background. And so let's go and do that for the rest of these elements. So here under this universal color, we can change it to the var text because that's going to be our text color. And then if we scroll down some more, keep going, the next one looks like this. A hover has the color of our blue. I believe that's our blue. Yes. So we can delete that and put var and then name it blue. This is not in our color scheme right now, so I'm just going to leave that. So let's scroll down. We see under button on line 113, our background color is set to our blue, so we can change it to blue. And our color is set to our background color. We would change it to that. And so now these are just looking at any of those variables that we've defined above. And so let's keep going, see if there's any other colors that we need to update. It does not look like it. Cool. So I guess we might not need that green actually. But now this is only going to apply to the element if it has a data theme equals light. But when we're changing with our button, we're going to want to change it to a data theme of dark. So let's define those colors now too. So we do the same thing as we did when we were defining these, but we just put the attribute value to dark. And this isn't going to impact our current website because we don't have data theme equals dark for anything yet. But here, yes, yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so we're back up here with our data theme equals dark. And then now we just want to reassign these names to a different value. So I'm also going to use text, and I'm going to set that to F6 F0 EE, and then I'm going to set background to 04, 02, 01. I will set my green to a different color, although I don't know if we're using our green, and I'll do that for blue as well. I'll give you a second to copy all those down. So essentially what this is now saying that we have these two blocks is if an element has the data theme attribute equal to light, use these colors for our variables. However, if it has data theme equals dark, use these colors. And this way, when we look down here at like line 22, where it says background color and then its var is background, we don't have to redefine another variable for something else and then change a bunch of things. This time it's just referencing what is the currently active value of background. In this case, because we only have data theme equals dark or light right now, sorry, it's going to use this value right here. But when we're doing our button, we're going to say, hey, switch the attribute from light to dark, then it's going to use this instead. So let's save that. And you'll see that nothing should have changed over here because we didn't actually change the colors itself. We're just rewriting it in a way that's going to be more helpful for us. All right. So that's the stuff about the variable colors. Now what we're going to do is I want to show you, we're going to stick with CSS for a little bit. And we're going to go and make these projects into a grid. And I find that when I'm working with something like a grid, that using those Chrome developer tools is really helpful to see stuff. So if I control click and then inspect, I can see my Chrome developer tools over here. And let me get rid of that. And so right now I have them laid out like this, but I'm looking to have them laid out in more of a grid shape. So I'm just going to slightly move this over so we can see it better. So what I need to do is very similar to how we did Flexbox, because remember we were doing setting the Flex container and then aligning the items in certain ways. But this time we are going to be using grid to do a very similar thing. So if I go to my HTML and I go and look at where my projects are listed, I can see that all of those project cards are listed inside of a div that has an ID equals to project section or projects section. So I'm going to use that. Let's create a new thing. This is project section. Target that ID. So it's that that pound symbol and then projects hyphen section. And before we did Flexbox, we did display flex, but now it's very similar. It's going to be display grid. And if I save, you'll notice that nothing really changed over here in our code, except when we go and we look at our projects section, we can now see that there's this grid button right here. And so when you click on the button, you'll see where these columns and these rows kind of start and end. And by default, it's going to try to give us some based on our current content, but we're going to be resizing it using our grid. So we need to determine how many columns and rows that we want to use. So you do that in this same container. And to put the columns, you use the grid hyphen template hyphen columns property. And there's a couple different ways that you can determine how many columns you want to put in your grid. And I just played around with it and I'm like, I want them to be equal sized because you can determine different sizes for the specific content. So I know that I want 12 because I want some content to be when it's like more expanded, like if I don't have Chrome Developer Tools open, I want there to be 3 cards side by side. And then if I'm going in a little bit more, I just want 2. And if I'm going in way more, I just want 1. And so I am going to use 12 columns. Now, I could just type in like 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels 12 times, and it'll create 12 different 100 pixel sized columns. But I want them to be a little bit more responsive to how big the page is, and I don't want to type it in 12 times. So we can use the repeat function to do this. So you just type in repeat, and then in these parentheses, your first value is going to be the number of columns that you want. So I want 12, and then I'm going to comma, and then I can put the size that I want them to be. So in this case, I want them to all be equal to each other. So I can put 1 FR. And what this is essentially saying is this is one fractional unit. And so it's saying I want 12 columns that are all one fractional unit to the whole. So they're all equal. If I wanted to have some that were bigger columns, I could create another 12, let's say, and put 2 FR. And so this would create 12 more columns that were twice as big as each of these. That's kind of the math. And so I'm going to delete that and end it with my semicolon. And we're going to do the same thing with our rows. So it's the very similar property. Instead of grid template columns, we have grid template rows. And this time I know I'm just going to have 2 for this main one. I'm developing for the bigger size. So I'm just going to do 1 FR, 1 FR like that. So this is because there's 2 different values. It knows that I want 2 columns and then that they're going to be equal to each other. And then I'm going to add the gap property. And this is going to determine the space between these different columns and rows. And I'm just going to put 25 pixels for now. And so I'm going to save this. And you'll notice it looks a little funky right now because we're still playing around. But essentially, it created my 12 columns. So if I go back to my from developer tools, you'll see that it created my columns. There's not enough space on this screen. And then there's my 2 rows that I've created. But they're trying to put my content in kind of weird ways that I am not really loving. So I will show you how you can do for each card, how to determine how big it should be in your grid. And so if I go back to my HTML and I look through here, each of these different projects has its own div, and it has an ID of project and then the number and then card. And so to target this first one, I can just do project -1 card. And now I know that I'm only going to be targeting my first project. So the long way to determine how big these content should be is you would do grid column start and set it to something, and then you would have grid column end to say where it should end. But there is a shorthand, and that is grid -area. And so this allows you to determine what column it should start at, which column it should end at, which row it can start at, and which row it should end at, all within one property. So the first value is going to be which row should it start at. So in this case, we can see with our Chrome developer tools that it's the very top one is 1 right here, and then this next one is 2. So I want this project 1 card to start on row 1 and do a space and then a /. Now it's a little confusing at first because this next value is not the row it should end at, but instead the column it should start at. So if I look at my columns, I know that I want it to be at 1. So I can put 1 here, and then space and another / and another space. And then now I'm setting my end values. So this is going to be my row end. So I want it to be ending at row 2, because I want it to go from 1 to 2. And so I can put 2 in here. I'm going to do a space, a / and another space. And then this is going to be my column end. So now I have 12 columns that I'm going to be using, and I want there to be 3 side by side. And so if you divide 12 by 3, you get 4. And so we would start at 1, we go to 2, to 3, to 4. However, this is only 3 columns if you're looking at this. So between 1 and 2 is 1 column, between 2 and 3 is another one, between 3 and 4 is another one. So if I wanted to span 4 columns, I actually have to say end at 5, because it's not going to go through 5. It's just going to go up to column 5. And so if I add 5 here and I save, I will see it's still a little funky because we haven't sized all of our other content. But now 1, and then it goes to 5, and then it also goes to 2. So now let's just go in. Yes. It's because we haven't sized everything else yet. Yeah. So let's go and size everything else. So we're going to do project 2 card. And it's very similar for us right now because it is going to start at row 1. It's going to end at row 2 because we want it on that same line as our first project. But the column start and end are going to be different. So we can start with 1 because that's our row start. But now we want it to start right after this card. So this ended at 5, so we're going to start this one at 5. So we'll start it at 5. It should end at row 2, like the other one. And then if we add 4 more, we want it to end at row 9. And then let's do our project 3 card, which is very similar with our grid area, where it should start at column 1, or row 1, sorry. But now we are going to start at column 9, and then we're going to end at row 2. And then now we are going to end at column 13. And the reason that it's 13 is because if I save and go back, you will see that to end it at the very end of my grid, there's like this almost invisible column to the right of it. So this is my 12th column, but it needs an end point, which is going to be 1 more at 13. So right now I can see that they're all on my 1 line from row 1 to row 2. And then each of them is from 4 columns wide. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The reason it looks a little uneven right now is because we haven't determined the size of these yet. So let's do that right now. So project 4 card, is going to be a little similar to our project one card because we wanted to use the same column values. We wanted to start at column 1 and end at column 5. But the row, we actually want it to start at 2 and end at 3 this time. So we will go and do grid area is 2 for row start, 1 for column start, 3 for row end. Remember, there's like that kind of extra one. And then our 5 for column end. For project 5 card, the rows are the same as our project 4, so 2 and 3, while our columns are the same as our project 2, so 5 and 9. So we should do 2, 5, 3, and then 9. And then our project 6 card also does the same rows, so 2 and 3, but then the same columns as our project 3, so 9 and 13. And so when I save this, you can see back in our website that they are all laid out in this nice grid. They're all equal size and they fill up my grid. Now you may notice that there's these negative numbers as well. You can also access a certain part, so like a column start or a column end using negative. It basically just goes the opposite direction. Where before we were saying, from column 1 to column 5, we could, if we really wanted to, say column -9 or column -13 to -9. Really, the only thing that I find that is really helpful with these negative numbers is if you don't know that like it ends at 13. So you could change it from start at 9 and then end at -1. And then if you save it, it does the same thing. It's just saying go to the end. So now we have our grid laid out, and it looks pretty good. But the issue is when we go down, it's going to stay in our grid and get it really weird when we resize to more of a mobile layout. So what I can do is use those media queries that I referenced to look at, hey, what size, what width are we using for our screen, and then change up these values. So to determine like what size you might want to use, I use Chrome Developer Tools, where before we use this button to select a given element in our page, the one right next to it will show different devices. And so I can do it responsive, so I can go like this and see how it works there. I could also, if I specifically want to find something for a given device here, I can play around and look how the size on the iPhone 14 Pro Max would look, which is bad right now. But under responsive, I can play around, and I like to do this to determine where do I think we should move to the next one. So I found that what I like is that if it is this 1050 width right here or more, I want it to be at this layout. But if it's 1050 or lower, I want to move it so that it's just two cards side by side. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a media query for this one right here. So everything that we made, we're going to put inside of a media query that says only use this grid if it is 1051 pixels wide or more. And so how you create a media query is a little bit different. So you use the @ symbol, like you're going to tag someone on social media, and then you type in the keyword media, and then you do space. And then in these parentheses, you're going to put the property that you want it to look for. So in this case, we are saying we want the width to be 1051 pixels or more. And so remember how we did like height and width with CSS? There's also max height, max width, min width. So if I were to put min hyphen width and then put 1051 pixels, this is now saying, hey, look at the user's device. And if it is 1050 pixels or more in our size, use this grid. And so create our curly brackets at the end. And then I would just cut the closing one and paste it at the end of our project 6 card. So I have my media query at media min width 1051 pixels, my opening squiggly bracket. And then within my media query, I have all of that grid code that we did. And then I place that closing curly bracket at the end of all of our grid code. So now if I save you'll notice that if it is anything lower than my 1051, that it goes back to that kind of default. But if I go more, it dynamically changes to that other grid. So now we need to create a new grid for a new size of stuff. So we'll do that again with a media query. So we'll do media, and this time I'm going to use a min width of 751 pixels, like this. But I also want it to not go over that 1051 because the anything between our 751 and our 1051 is going to have maybe some duplicate code applying to it, and it might be some weird functionality. So we can add an additional check here. So after this parenthesis, if you do a space and then type in and, you're going to add another thing here to say a range, basically. So we'll do max width, and we'll put that at 1050 pixels, and then do our opening and closing squiggly brackets. So now we can create a new grid that is going to change when we go from between the 751 minimum and this 1050 maximum. So again, we have to declare on our projects section ID that display grid, and we do have to make our columns and our rows again. So we're going to do grid template columns, but this time I just want 2 cards side by side instead of 3. So I can do repeat 2 1FR. So this is going to create 2 columns that are equal width to each other. And then I am also going to create my rows with grid template rows, but this time because we have only 2 by each other, and we're going to have 6 total, we need 3 rows instead of the 2 that we were working with before. So I can do repeat 3 1FR to create 3 rows, and then our gap of 25 pixels. Now we need to add that sizing for each individual card again as well. So if we add the ID for project 1 card, we're going to do grid area, and it's going to start at row 1. It's going to start at column 1. That's going to end at row 2, and it's going to end at column 2. So again, it's row start, row end, column end. Now let's add it for our project 2 card. And here for the rows, it's the same. So we want it to start on row 1. For the column now, we wanted to start on column 2. We want it to end on row 2. And because we know that we want it to be at the end of our grid, so at the very last of that column, we can do that -1 for our ending. All right. So let's keep going with our project 3. Now this one's going to be slightly different because now we're on a new row. So if I were to save this and I go back here, you'll notice it does it actually pretty well automatically. But I want to make sure that it doesn't do some weird stuff where it for some reason changes it on me. And I want to make sure that I'm defining the rest of these as well. So now I would start on row 2, but column 1, and I would end at the 3rd row, and I would end at the 2nd column. So it's 2, 1, 3, 2. And then for our 4th card, we would put the grid area equal to the 2nd row, the 2nd column, the 3rd row to end it, and the -1 column to end it. So it's at the end. We'll add our project 5 card, which we're going to start at row 3 in column 1. And then we're going to end at row 4 in column 2. And then we'll do the same for 6, where it is grid area starting at row 1 in column 2, then ending at row 4 and the -1 column. So I'll give you a second to copy that down if you need. And if you're ever getting lost with the numbers and knowing exactly what you want to put where, I would use that Chrome Developer Tools grid and seeing what numbers they put in that layout that you can see. Okay, so the next thing that we would do is we would add one for that under 750. So when it is kind of more on this mobile, you can create it where it's just 1 column and then 6 rows, and that making sure that they're all staying the same there. But I will leave that for you to do as kind of further practice if you would like. All right. So the last thing I want to show you in CSS before we jump into our JavaScript is you'll notice right now with our links up here, when we hover over them, we get this little pointer thing that also shows that it's clickable. But when we hover over like one of our buttons or like our dark mode button, it doesn't actually show that cursor, even if it is clickable, like this contact button right here. I actually don't know if there's any functionality if you click it. But how you can do that is changing the cursor value. So I'm adding a new section called cursor in my CSS code, and I'm going to add it to the ID of dark mode link, which is, if you look into the HTML code and we go there, that is this A thing for our button. And then I'm going to add the pseudo class of hover. So you do the colon hover. So this is only going to apply when you hover over it. Let's add a comma and then add button hover. So this is going to add when you hover over any of the button elements as well. And it's the cursor property. So there's a bunch of different ones that you can do, but pointer is going to be that little hand that we saw elsewhere. So when we save that and we go over and we hover over it, we can see that it changes to match the rest of our links. All right. So now let's start doing some JavaScript so we can see some functionality here. So if you open up the page in Chrome Developer Tools again, and I'm going to turn off this grid button so it's stopped showing. So you can do that by going to where that grid is in our project main section, and then turning off where it says grid. And so the cool things for JavaScript in the Chrome Developer Tools is right here in this console right here. In JavaScript, you can directly log stuff here. So if I wanted to say like 4 plus 5 and I enter, it's going to give me 9. And so this is how we're going to use to make sure that we're linking our JavaScript correctly. Like remember with CSS, we kind of changed everything to blue just to see this console is where we're going to see to make sure that we have linked it exactly how we want to. So let's go back to our VS Code. And if you hover over that folder name, click on the first plus to add a new file. And let's name it script.js. The .js stands for JavaScript. And when we enter, you'll see that we have our new JavaScript file. Very similarly to CSS, we have to link it to our HTML document for it to actually show some stuff. Before, we were doing our CSS linking up here in the head section. And remember, when a browser is viewing a website, it's reading from the top to the bottom. So when it's reading here, it gets to our CSS and it's saying, okay, here's all the styles. And then as it's displaying all these elements, it's displaying how we want them to. However, if we were to put our JavaScript link up here and then try to say, hey, look for this certain element in our HTML, it's not going to know that that element exists yet because it's all the way down here. Additionally, JavaScript code, depending on how much you have added, can really slow down your site. And so we want it to be the very last thing that is in our body section. So if you scroll all the way down to right above this body closing tag, so there should be around line 160 in your code. We are going to use the script tag to link to our JavaScript file. So instead of that link, we're going to do script, and then you're going to put the src or the source equal to that JavaScript file that we created. So remember to look in the folder that you're currently in, you would do a period /, and then it should be right here. If it's not, if it was added into your assets folder, you might need to go in there and see where it's added, but it should hopefully be just right over here. And then let's close it out. And you'll notice that it does add this ending tag. And this is because if you want to write JavaScript code in your HTML document, you can do all of that in between these two tags. Similarly to with CSS, how you can write the style tag and then write all your CSS in there. But again, we do like to separate it so that all of our code is separate in case if something goes wrong, or that way when we open up our HTML document, we're not flooded with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code staring back at us. So let's save our HTML document, and then let's just make sure that this works. So if you open up your script.js, we're going to write our first line of JavaScript code. And if you want to display something in that console that's over here, what we would want to do is use the console.log method. So console.log, and then in parentheses right after, we would want to write some text or a number or something. So I am just going to put in between these quotation marks, I'm just going to put hello, and then I'm going to end it with that semicolon. So now if I save and I go back to my Chrome Developer Tools, you can see that my hello was logged. Now, you'll also see that I have this error right here. And it's showing for me with this injected.js. This is from that live server extension in VS Code. It essentially needs to add some JavaScript to run it when you're like saving your code that it does this. So something is acting up here, but I know that my JavaScript is working because I can see hello. All right, so we can delete that. We know that our file is linked correctly, and we can start writing out our code. But before I even do that, I like to think of kind of logic behind some of the things that I'm trying to do, because I find that jumping into programming can sometimes be a little difficult to handle, because you're writing all of this code, trying to see if it's working, and then you get to the end and there's probably a better way you could have wrote it, or you could have avoided some of the errors that you're having. So I like to think about the logic behind what I'm trying to do when I'm doing JavaScript. So in this case, I want when a user goes to my site, I want it to load in this light theme by default, which is how I have that data theme equals light at the beginning. If someone clicks this moon icon, I want the color scheme to change to dark, and I want the button to change to a sun. And you'll notice that in my assets and then my images, I have a dark mode button and a light mode button right here. These are both saved as .svg files, which is scalable vector graphics. So if you click on one, this is all of the code that actually makes up the content of that button. I did not write this code. How I do it is I open up Illustrator. If you have access to Adobe and Illustrator, I made my logos over here in Illustrator. And then if you do File, Export, Export for Screens, down here, I selected my icons that I wanted, and then I changed from PNG to SVG. If you want to go further in web development and learn how to do SVG code, you can do some really cool things about like animating these images so that maybe like when you click the moon, it like all the particles move and like form a sun if you really wanted to do that. It's a little difficult and beyond what we're doing. But for all intents and purposes, I just create it in Illustrator and then save it as an SVG. But then, going further with our logic, once it is switched to dark mode and it has that sun icon, when someone clicks that, I want it to change back to a light theme, and I want the icon to change back to a moon. So how we have to do this, we have to do that little bit of a jump into this adding JavaScript to our website. So what we need to do is access our button right here with our JavaScript. And so how you do that is if we go back to this DOM, we have this document option. And so that's actually what we have to type first. So if we type out document, this is essentially saying, hey, look in this HTML document, this file, and we're going to look for something. So if you do a period, and it's actually already showed up for us, it's this query selector. So if I click on that, and then I put some parentheses, now I'm going to specify which item that I want it to search for. So in this case, it is our button right here. And the thing about query selector is it's only going to select the very first one. So if I were to put something like P right here in, you actually do have to put it in between quotation marks. But if I were to put P, it's only going to select my first paragraph element of the whole thing. So let's go back to my HTML. And if I go and find this image, right, where is it? We have dark mode button as our ID in this image. And so I can do the same thing in here to access something with an ID. So it's that hashtag, that £, and then that name. So essentially what this code is doing is it's saying, hey, look in the document and then try to find the first thing with an ID that is equal to dark mode button. Now I'm going to probably be using this later and later and like trying to access it multiple times. Because remember, I'm like going to click it once and it's going to change, but then when I click it, I want it to go back. So I know that I'm going to be trying to access this button multiple times. If you remember back from the like very quick run through of JavaScript concepts, if you want to save some sort of code or data to use later, we use a variable. And so you can create that if we go to the way beginning of our code, and let's type in var space, and this is going to create our variable. And let's name it theme button, and then you set it equal. And remember, JavaScript does this camel casing where the first word has the lowercase first letter, and then every subsequent word has a capitalized first letter. And when we set it equal, this is essentially now, whenever we want to access our button, we just have to type in this theme button name. We don't have to type in document.query selector and so on and so forth. If you don't want to save it to a variable, you can just keep on typing that in and in and in. So it hasn't done anything yet. So we want to add some functionality for when a user clicks on this button. And we have to, if we remember that slide that I introduced JavaScript on, I said you can base it off of user events, like a hover or a click. And so in order to have the code look for when someone is clicking on this item, we need to add what's called an event listener to this button. So if you go down to line 3, I always like put a bunch of extra lines just so it looks a lot easier to read. You can just type in that theme button name. So this is now accessing this entire string of code without having to write that again and again. And then I'm going to put a period, and then I'm going to use what's called a method, and it's called add event listener. And as you start typing, it should show up like this. You open up the parentheses, and the first value, because we're going to put 2, the first one is the type of event that you're looking for. So in our case, it's going to be click. And we're going to place that in between our quotation. If you go after the quotation marks and you add a comma, now we are going to specify what we want to happen when a user clicks on this button. And one of the concepts I introduced before was the function. And this is going to be when something happens, we want code to run again and again every time something happens. So we are going to declare a function later, but let's just create the name for it right here. So we're going to do theme toggle. So what this line of code is now saying is when a user clicks on our dark mode button, run the theme toggle function. Now, we need to create that function for there to actually be something that happens here. So let's do that right now. To create any function, you just got to type in the keyword function, and then the name, which we've already put as theme toggle. And then you do parentheses, and let's leave them empty and go to the end, do a space, and then do our curly brackets. So this is now our function. So we have look for our dark mode button, add this click functionality, run the theme toggle function, and now we have that theme toggle function existing, but there's no code. Now, if you want to add comments to be like what each thing is doing so you can look on later, you can do that in JavaScript as well. So you do that with 2 forward slashes to create a single line comment. So this would be like add a listener to look for clicks on the dark mode button or something like that. If you want to write a multi-line comment, it's the same as CSS, where it's that forward slash and then the asterisk, and then you type, and you could type, keep going, and you can add as much of a comment as you want until you do the reverse to close it. So now we want to look at the current theme that the user is seeing, because we wanted to say if it's light, change to dark, and if it's dark, change to light. And this is why I went through that logic exercise before of just like speaking about it in English so that I could know later on, like I'm going to need to know what the current theme is. So we're going to want to save that to our new variable that we're going to call current theme equals. And then now we have to access our document again. So we would do document.query selector and then open up the parentheses. And again, this only looks for the very first one. So I'm going to be looking for what is this attribute set to right now. So right now our HTML is set from data theme is light. So there's only one HTML element, so I can just do HTML in quotation marks because it's only going to look for the first one and there is only one, so pretty easy. And then if you do another period and then you type in get attribute with a lowercase g and a capital case A, and then here we're going to want to put the attribute's name. So we're going to put data theme. So now I want to make sure that this is working correctly because we've added a bunch of stuff and I just want to make sure that I'm not going off the rails and something's not working. So let's use that console log method again, but within our function. So let's do console.log and then in there type in current theme. And this is essentially going to say, hey, look for what is the value in our current theme variable. And because we're including it in our function, it is only going to run when we click on our button. Because up here we said, look for our button, look for when it's clicked, run our theme toggle function. And then now in our theme toggle function, we say log something to our console. And so if I go back here, you'll notice I don't see that hello automatically. But when I click on this button, I can see light. And the reason why is because our code is saying when you click on this button, run the theme toggle function. And in our theme toggle function, we're saying save whatever the current data theme attribute value is to current theme and then put it to the console. So this is saving the string of light to current theme. And they were saying, hey, show us what that is. And it's light. Okay, so I know that all of my current code is working. Great. So now we want to start adding that logic of if it's light, change to dark. If it's dark, change to light. And remember, we can look at that using our conditional statements, if it will go over. There we go. So we're going to say if the current theme is light, do this. Otherwise, do this other thing. So we can do that by creating this if statement by typing in if and then a space. And then we have our parentheses because we need to add some sort of a property and say if it is equal to this. And so we already have our current theme saved to a variable. So we can just say current theme. And so now we're saying if our current theme is equal to something, and remember we have to do that 3 equal signs, and then let's type in light in our quotations. So this piece of code is now saying if the user's current theme on the code is light, let's do something. And so you can do that by doing this opening and closing curly brackets. And then the code in here is going to be what's run if the current theme is light. Now, if you're going to have multiple different themes, let's say you had a red one, an orange one, a yellow one, a green one, you could do if current theme equals red, and then say else if current theme equals orange, do something else. But because we only have 2 values, there's only going to be if it's light or if it's dark. So we can just put else and then put another curly bracket for code that's going to happen if it's not light. All right. So now what we're going to do is we are going to say if it is light, and remember this is only happening if a user is clicking on this button. So if a user clicks on the button, look for what their current theme is by looking at this attribute. And then if it's light, we want to change it to dark. And so how we do this is if you tab in, I like to just keep it all organized. We're going to do that same accessing our document, doing our query selector, and then doing our HTML because we want to change our attribute's value from light to dark. And remember, I set these in our CSS up here. So light or dark. So if you typed it in differently, you'll want to type it in the same, however you put it in right here. And so instead of using get attribute to get the value, you can use set attribute to change the value. This one takes 2 values here. So the first one is going to be what attribute do you want to set? So our case, it's data theme. And then the next one is going to be what you want to set it to. So it's going to be set to dark. And then let's close that off right here. And then in our else statement, and remember, this is going to happen anytime the current theme is not light. Let's change this, just copy and paste it and change it to dark or light, sorry. So now this is saying if the current theme is light and a user clicks on the button, change that attribute's value to dark. Otherwise, if it's set to something else, change it to light. So now I'm going to save and I'm going to go back to my Chrome Developer Tools. And when I click on it, it does it, which is really cool. But you may notice one thing is not changing, and that's our image. It is staying a moon no matter what. So we're going to have to do that as well. But just so you know where these colors are coming from, it's coming from these that we've set in our CSS. So all of our text is changing from this to this because we're using two different values for text. And when we call text later on, it's just looking at which one is actually being active, and that's dependent on what our attribute is set to. So now we can do the very same thing with setting an attribute, because if we go back to our HTML and we go to where that button is, we can see the image source equals this, and that's where that link to that button is. But I want to change it to this light mode button over here. And so we can do the very similar thing. So this time we are going to access our image, but remember we saved it up here to a variable. So we don't have to do document, query selector, IDs, dark mode button, because we've already done that up here. And we've saved it to theme button. So we can just type in theme button and then period. And then it knows that this is what I mean by that because I've saved it. So then I can do set attribute again. And remember, the first value is going to be the attribute you want to change. So in this case, it's our src or our source. We'll add a comma. And then the next thing is going to be what we want to change that link to. So in this case, we have assets, images, dark mode button. We can see that in our file structure over here, we have assets, and then underneath we have images, and that's where we have our light and dark mode. So we can just type it in the exact same. So period, / assets, / images, / and then the name, light, space, mode, space, button, .svg. If you want to be absolutely sure, you can just go to that HTML, copy what I've put here, and then change dark to light. And then let's add the semicolon down here to make sure that we're closing that off. And then copy this whole thing because we're going to do the same exact thing in our else statement and just change the word light to dark. So now when we have it set where it's not only changing our color theme, but it's also changing our button. So if I go back to Chrome Developer Tools and I click on it, I can see it now changes to the different things every time I click.
Try to highlight it, copy. There's like a light bulb on the left.
There's a, though sometimes with light bulbs, they'll try to be like, oh, we suggest you do this or something. You can just ignore it. All right. So that is our content. We did a lot of, I think, cool stuff today where we did our variable colors so that we don't have to keep putting the same color in multiple times. You can just declare it once and then call it later. We made our grid pretty dynamic, so it does change when certain sizes are happening. If you're curious, these width points of where it changes, you can call those breakpoints. And so if you look up like typical like breakpoint CSS, it'll say like for mobile, you should do around here. For new tablet, you should do around here if you want to do that. And then, yeah, we did some JavaScript to add functionality to this button and change it from light to dark.